9:17 in the morning, January 22nd, 1943. The air hangs thick and humid over Point Cruz, Guadalcanal, carrying the smell of rotting vegetation and something worse, something metallic. A young American officer lies flat in the ruins of a Japanese bunker, his cheek pressed against the wooden stock of a rifle that doesn't belong here. His breathing is slow, controlled. 3 heartbeats between each exhale. 240 yards away, in the crown of a banyan tree, a Japanese sniper shifts his weight ever so slightly. A single leaf trembles. Lieutenant John George sees it. His finger tightens on the trigger. The Winchester barks once. The tree crown goes still. 1 down, 10 more to go. This is the story of how a mail-order hunting rifle, dismissed as a toy by every officer in the battalion, became the most feared weapon in the Pacific jungle. And if you're as fascinated by these forgotten stories of World War II as I am, make sure to subscribe to this channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. To understand what happened in those sweltering groves west of Point Cruz, we need to go back. Back before the bullets, before the jungle, before Guadalcanal became a word that American mothers would learn to dread. We need to understand the man who would become Japan's worst nightmare in those trees, John B. George was born on May 1st, 1918, in Missouri, a state where a boy learned to shoot almost before he learned to walk. His father placed a rifle in his hands at the age of 7, and something clicked. Not just the mechanical action of the firearm, but something deeper. The way the world narrowed down to a single point of focus. The way his breathing slowed naturally when his eye found the sight picture. The way his heartbeat seemed to pause at the moment of the shot. By his teenage years, George wasn't just a good shot. He was a phenomenon. He competed in matches at Camp Perry, Ohio, the cathedral of American marksmanship, where the best riflemen in the nation gathered to test themselves against each other. He didn't just compete, he won. But winning trophies and punching paper targets at known distances is one thing. What John George developed during those years was something far more valuable. He developed an intimate understanding of ballistics, of how a bullet behaves as it travels through air, how it drops, how wind pushes it, how temperature and humidity affect its flight. He learned to read the subtle signs that tell a skilled shooter where his bullet will go before he ever pulls the trigger, the shimmer of heat rising from the ground, the way grass bends in a breeze that hasn't reached him yet, the angle of shadows that reveal the position of an unseen sun. These were the skills that would save his life and end the lives of many Japanese soldiers in the years to come. When George joined the Illinois National Guard, he made a decision that his fellow soldiers found puzzling. He took 2 full years of his military pay, every dollar he earned drilling on weekends and attending summer camps, and he sent it to a mail-order catalog. What he received in return was a wooden crate containing a Winchester Model 70 bolt-action rifle, chambered in .30-06 caliber. He topped it with a Lyman Alaskan scope, a piece of precision optics designed for hunting in the vast wilderness of America's last frontier. The Model 70 was, and arguably still is, one of the finest production bolt-action rifles ever manufactured. Winchester had introduced it in 1936, and within a few years, it had earned a reputation for accuracy that bordered on legendary. The action was smooth and precise. The trigger broke clean and crisp. The barrel was hammer-forged to tolerances that most rifles of the era couldn't match. In the hands of a skilled marksman, it could place shots into a group the size of a quarter at 100 yards and maintain lethal accuracy at distances far beyond what the standard infantry rifle could achieve. But here's the thing about the Winchester Model 70 that mattered most in the context of what was about to happen. It was a bolt-action rifle. In an era when the United States military had embraced the semi-automatic M1 Garand as its standard infantry weapon, the idea of going to war with a bolt action seemed almost quaint. obsolete. The Garand could fire 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. George's Winchester held 5 rounds, and each one required him to manually work the bolt before he could fire again. On paper, this seemed like a terrible disadvantage. In the jungle hell of Guadalcanal, it would prove to be exactly what was needed. December 7, 1941, the date that changed everything. Pearl Harbor exploded into flames and smoke, and suddenly America was at war. John George and his fellow National Guardsmen were activated and prepared for deployment. In the chaos of mobilization, George made a request that his commanding officers found somewhere between amusing and annoying. He wanted his personal rifle shipped to him overseas. The military mail system was already straining under the weight of letters from sweethearts and packages from worried mothers. The idea of shipping a civilian hunting rifle halfway around the world seemed absurd. Captain Morris, his company commander, pulled George aside. "Son," he said, "you're going to war, a real war, with real enemies who shoot back. Leave your toy at home and carry a real weapon." The M1 Garand is the finest infantry rifle in the world. It'll do everything you need it to do and more. George nodded politely. He didn't argue, but he also didn't withdraw his request. The Winchester model. 70 sat in a warehouse in Illinois while George and the 132nd Infantry Regiment shipped out for the Pacific. He spent the long voyage watching other men clean their Garands, maintaining weapons that weren't his, waiting for word that might never come. The 132nd Infantry Regiment was part of the 23rd Infantry Division, which would earn the nickname Americal, a portmanteau of America and New Caledonia. The division was cobbled together from various units and rushed to the Pacific to reinforce the Marines who had landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942. Those Marines had captured a critical Japanese airfield renamed Henderson Field, and now they were bleeding to hold it against increasingly desperate Japanese counterattacks. The Army was coming to help, but the Army was walking into a fight unlike anything they had trained for. Guadalcanal in late 1942 was a green hell. The jungle grew so thick in places that visibility dropped to a few yards. 100-foot trees formed a canopy that blocked out the sun, creating a perpetual twilight where anything could be hiding. The heat was oppressive, the humidity suffocating. Rain came in torrents that turned trails into rivers of mud. Insects swarmed in clouds that crawled into ears and noses and mouths. Malaria struck down men who had never been touched by enemy fire. Dysentery reduced strong soldiers to hollow shells. And somewhere in that green maze, the Japanese were waiting. The 132nd Infantry arrived on Guadalcanal on December 8, 1942, exactly 1 year and 1 day after Pearl Harbor. They were ordered to relieve elements of the exhausted 1st Marine Division and prepare for offensive operations against Japanese positions on Mount Austin and the surrounding fortified areas. The Japanese had constructed an elaborate defensive network that American intelligence called the Gifu, a maze of bunkers and tunnels and fighting positions that would cost American lives to crack. But before the 132nd could assault the Gifu, they had to deal with a more immediate problem: Japanese snipers. The Japanese military had developed sniper doctrine with meticulous care. Their sniper rifles, primarily the Type 97, based on the Type 38 Arisaka Action, were fitted with 2.5 power telescopic sights that American officers grudgingly admitted were superior to most of what the Allies possessed. But the real advantage Japanese snipers held wasn't in their equipment. It was in their patience and their willingness to sacrifice. A Japanese sniper would climb high into the jungle canopy, sometimes 90 feet above the ground, and lash himself to a branch with rope or vines. He would carry minimal supplies, sometimes just a small bag of rice and a canteen of water. He would wait, hours, days, if necessary. He understood that he was probably not coming down from that tree alive. His mission was to exact the highest possible price from the Americans before they found him and eliminated him, One life for as many American lives as he could take before the end. The psychological impact of these snipers far exceeded their physical toll. American soldiers learned to dread the jungle. Every step forward might be your last. Every tree might hide death. The crack of a rifle might come from anywhere, from any direction, and the man walking beside you would simply crumple to the ground with a hole in his head. Officers and NCOs were prime targets. A Japanese sniper trained to look for the subtle signs that marked a leader, the men who gave orders, the men who pointed at maps, the men who others looked to for direction. Remove them, and the American unit lost its cohesion, its ability to respond, its will to fight. In late December 1942, a supply sergeant found John George and handed him a wooden crate marked fragile. His Winchester had arrived. 6 weeks it had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to a supply depot in the Pacific to Guadalcanal. George unpacked it with the care of a father reuniting with a child. He checked the action. He inspected the barrel. He mounted the Lyman Alaskan scope and adjusted it with meticulous precision. When he emerged from his tent carrying the rifle, his fellow platoon leaders exchanged glances. "There goes George with his mail-order sweetheart," one of them said. The comment got laughs. It wouldn't be funny for long. January 1943. The Point Cruz operation. Japanese forces had established defensive positions in the groves west of Point Cruz, using the dense vegetation as cover for a network of snipers who were systematically dismantling American patrols. In just 72 hours, 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment were neutralized by sniper fire. Officers, sergeants, radio men, anyone who looked important, anyone who stood still for too long. The unit's advance had ground to a halt, paralyzed by an enemy they couldn't see. The standard American response to snipers was volume of fire. Identify the general area where the sniper might be hiding and pour rounds into it until something fell out of the trees. The M1 Garand excelled at this approach. 8 rounds of .30-06 delivered as fast as a man could aim and squeeze. But the Japanese snipers had adapted. They positioned themselves in areas where multiple trees offered concealment. They waited for the Americans to exhaust their ammunition on the wrong target. And then they fired again. Lieutenant George proposed a different approach. Counter-sniping. Not suppression, but precision elimination. Find the sniper before he fires. Put one round exactly where it needs to go. Move to the next target. His commanding officer was skeptical. The Winchester held 5 rounds against the Garand's 8. It fired slowly. It was a civilian weapon. But 14 men were already gone, and the standard approach wasn't working. George was given permission to try. January 22, 1943. George moved into position before dawn, crawling through mud and undergrowth to reach the ruins of a Japanese bunker that had been abandoned earlier in the campaign. The bunker offered concealment and a clear field of fire toward the grove where intelligence suggested the snipers were operating. He settled in. He waited. The sun rose. The jungle came alive with the sounds of insects and birds and the distant rumble of artillery from other parts of the island. George's breathing slowed to the rhythm he had learned at Camp Perry. His eye found the scope. His finger rested lightly on the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself. Not yet. Hours passed. The heat became suffocating. Sweat ran down George's face and dripped onto the stock of his rifle. He didn't move to wipe it away. Movement attracted attention. Movement got you eliminated. He watched. He waited. And then, at 9:17 in the morning, he saw it. 240 yards away. A single leaf trembling in a tree crown where no breeze stirred. The movement was almost imperceptible, a shift of weight, a repositioning of a body that had been still for too long. The Japanese sniper was preparing to fire. George's crosshairs found the spot. His finger moved to the trigger. 3 heartbeats? exhale. The Winchester spoke. The sound was sharp and clean in the humid air. The leaf stopped trembling. Something fell from the tree, crashing through branches, and hit the jungle floor with a thump that George heard even at this distance. One down. But George didn't celebrate. He didn't move. He worked the bolt action smoothly, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round. Then he waited again. Because he knew something that the textbooks didn't teach. Japanese snipers often worked in pairs or small teams. Where there was one, there were likely more, and if he moved now, if he gave away his position, he would become the target instead of the hunter. 20 minutes later, movement in another tree. This one was closer, perhaps 180 yards. A subtle shift of shadows that didn't match the angle of the sun. George's scope found the spot. He could see just barely the outline of a rifle barrel protruding from a cluster of leaves. The Japanese sniper was scanning for targets, unaware that his partner was already gone. George waited for the barrel to stop moving. When it did, he fired. The second sniper fell. By noon, George had eliminated 4 Japanese snipers. He had fired 4 rounds. Each shot had found its mark, but the day was far from over. Reports came in of sniper activity in other sectors. George moved, crawling through drainage ditches and using dead ground to mask his movement from observation. He set up in a new position, this time near a shell crater that offered both concealment and a backstop to prevent his silhouette from showing against the sky. And the hunt continued. This is where the story gets extraordinary. Subscribe if you're finding this fascinating, and stay with me, because what happened over the next 4 days changed the way the American military thought about precision shooting in jungle warfare. The Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz groves were not amateurs. They were trained soldiers who had been taught their craft by an army that took marksmanship seriously. But they were facing something they had never encountered before. A counter-sniper who combined world-class shooting ability with equipment specifically designed for precision work at extended ranges. The Lyman Alaskan scope on George's Winchester provided magnification that the standard iron sights of the Garand simply couldn't match. It allowed him to spot movement, to identify targets, to place his shots with surgical accuracy. More importantly, George understood something fundamental about the psychology of the sniper duel. Patience was the key. The Japanese snipers were patient, yes, but they were patient in attack, waiting for the right target to present itself. George was patient in defense, waiting for the sniper to reveal himself. Every shot he fired gave away his position, but by the time the enemy could react, he was already moving to a new location, already setting up for the next engagement. The Japanese couldn't adapt fast enough. On the second day, George faced his most dangerous engagement. He had set up near a water-filled crater, using the reflection of the sky on the water surface to create a false horizon that would confuse anyone trying to spot him. A Japanese sniper had been working this sector, and George knew he was out there somewhere. The problem was locating him before he located George. The solution came from an unexpected source. George noticed that birds in a particular section of the grove had stopped singing. Everywhere else, the jungle chorus continued, but in one area, perhaps 300 yards distant, silence. Something had disturbed them, something that wasn't supposed to be there. George trained his scope on that section and waited. For over an hour, nothing moved. The birds gradually returned to their songs, and then, just when patience seemed like it might not be enough, a Japanese soldier stood up in the rocks at the far end of the grove. It was a mistake born of human weakness. The sniper had been in position for too long. His muscles were cramped. He needed to stretch, to shift his weight, to relieve the agony of maintaining an unnatural position for hours on end. He probably thought he was safe. He was 300 yards from the nearest American position in heavy cover, and he had seen no movement all day. He stood for perhaps 3 seconds. George's crosshairs found his chest. The Winchester fired. The Japanese soldier dropped and did not rise. By the evening of January 25th, the fourth day of the operation, Lieutenant John George had confirmed the elimination of 11 Japanese snipers, 11 shots, 11 targets neutralized. The Point Cruz groves, which had been a killing ground for American soldiers, fell silent. The 132nd Infantry was able to resume its advance. But the cost of this achievement was not measured only in spent cartridges and enemy casualties. George had looked through his scope at 11 human beings and made the decision to end their lives. Each one had been a person with a name, a family, a history. Each one had been a soldier doing his duty, just as George was doing his. The calculus of war demanded these actions, but it did not make them easy. In his memoir, Shots Fired in Anger, George would write about the experience with remarkable honesty. He described the mechanical precision of the shooting, the technical challenges of the jungle environment. But he also acknowledged the weight of what he had done. These were not paper targets at Camp Perry. They were men. What made George's accomplishment possible was not just his skill with a rifle, though that skill was extraordinary. It was the weapon itself. The Winchester Model 70, the mail-order toy that his officers had mocked, proved to be exactly the right tool for the job. The bolt action, which seemed like a disadvantage compared to the semi-automatic Garand, actually forced George to make every shot count. There was no temptation to spray and pray, no instinct to keep pulling the trigger until the magazine was empty. One shot, one adjustment, one shot. The discipline that the bolt action imposed matched perfectly with the discipline that effective counter-sniping required. The Lyman Alaskan scope was equally important. Designed for hunters who needed to make precise shots in challenging conditions, it provided clear optics and reliable adjustment even in the humidity and heat of the Pacific jungle. George had zeroed the rifle meticulously before the operation, walking his shots onto targets at known distances until he knew exactly where the bullet would go, at 100 yards, 200 yards, 300 yards. When the moment came to engage, there was no guesswork, just mathematics and muscle memory and the cold calculation of a rifleman doing what he had trained his entire life to do. The story of Point Cruz spread through the 132nd Infantry and beyond. The mail-order sweetheart had become a legend. Officers who had dismissed George's rifle as a toy now looked at it with new respect. Some of them quietly began to wonder if perhaps the American military had overlooked something in its rush to embrace semi-automatic firepower. Volume of fire was valuable, yes, but there were situations where precision mattered more, where one perfect shot was worth more than 100 hurried ones. George's war was far from over. On February 7, 1943, while operating near the Tanamaboo River, a Japanese rifleman caught him in the open. The bullet struck George in the left shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him to the ground. A fellow soldier named Hayes dragged him to cover and called for a medic. The wound was serious but not fatal. George was evacuated for treatment, and his time on Guadalcanal came to an end. But his war continued. After recovering from his wounds, George was assigned to one of the most extraordinary units in the American military, Merrill's Marauders. Officially designated the 5,307th Composite Unit Provisional, the Marauders were a long-range penetration force trained to operate behind Japanese lines in Burma. Their mission was to disrupt enemy communications, attack supply depots, and tie down Japanese forces that would otherwise be available to oppose the Allied advance. It was dangerous, exhausting, and deadly work. In February 1944, 2,750 Marauders crossed the Patkai mountain range and entered Burma. They were about to begin a 1,000-mile march through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. The jungle was even more unforgiving than Guadalcanal. The enemy was more numerous and more desperate. Disease stalked the column like a predator, striking down men who had survived countless firefights. Malaria, dysentery, typhus. The marauders fought not just the Japanese, but their own failing bodies. George carried his Winchester Model 70 through it all. The rifle that had proven itself in the jungles of Guadalcanal now faced an even greater test. In Burma, the marauders engaged in a series of brutal actions against Japanese forces from the 18th Division. At Wallabom, they killed between 400 and 500 enemy soldiers while suffering minimal casualties themselves. Near Npom Ga, surrounded and outnumbered, they held their position against repeated Japanese assaults, inflicting 400 enemy casualties while losing only 57 of their own. The Japanese were consistently surprised by the volume and accuracy of fire that the marauders could deliver. Every man in the unit was trained to a high level of marksmanship, and almost every man carried a semi-automatic or automatic weapon. But for situations that required precision, for eliminating key targets at extended ranges, the bolt-action rifles in the unit proved invaluable. George and a handful of other skilled marksmen served as the eyes and the precision instruments of their companies, spotting targets that others missed and engaging them with single, devastating shots. On May 17, 1944, the marauders achieved one of their key objectives, the capture of Myitkyina Airfield. The operation was a tactical success, but a human tragedy. The unit that marched into Burma with nearly 3,000 men was, by this point, combat ineffective. Too many casualties, too many sick, too many months in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. Of the original marauders, only a handful were still capable of fighting. The rest had been evacuated, hospitalized, or buried in the Burmese jungle. George survived. His Winchester survived. The rifle that had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma emerged from the campaign battered but functional. It had killed at least 14 confirmed enemy soldiers across 2 theaters of war, probably more. George stopped counting after Burma. After the war, George returned to the United States. He attended Princeton University and pursued a career that allowed him to continue his passion for firearms and shooting. He eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel and wrote one of the most remarkable memoirs of the Pacific War, titled Shots Fired in Anger. The book combined personal narrative with technical analysis, examining not just what happened, but why. George dissected American and Japanese weapons, tactics, and training with the analytical eye of a scientist and the practical experience of a combat veteran. The book became required reading for generations of military marksmen. George's Winchester Model 70 sat in a footlocker for years after the war. The rifle that officers had called a toy, that his fellow platoon leaders had dismissed as a mail-order sweetheart, had proven itself in the most demanding conditions imaginable. It had faced the best snipers the Japanese military could field and emerged victorious. It had helped break the back of enemy resistance in the Point Cruz groves and contributed to operations across the Pacific and Asian theaters. The legacy of John George and his mail-order rifle extended far beyond his personal achievements. The success of precision counter-sniping on Guadalcanal contributed to a gradual shift in American military thinking. The United States Marine Corps eventually adopted the Winchester Model 70 as a sniper rifle, recognizing what George had demonstrated in combat. The Marines fitted their Model 70s with inertial telescopic sights and used them to deadly effect in Korea and Vietnam. The rifle that had been dismissed as obsolete in 1942 became a cornerstone of Marine Corps sniper doctrine for decades. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. This is the kind of deep, detailed history that I love to share on this channel. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe and the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. The story of John George and his Winchester Model 70 carries lessons that extend beyond military history. It is a reminder that institutional wisdom is not always right. The officers who dismissed George's rifle were not foolish men. They were trained professionals who understood the prevailing doctrine of their time. That doctrine said that semi-automatic firepower was the future, that the bolt-action rifle was a relic of an earlier age. They weren't wrong exactly. The M1 Garand was indeed an excellent weapon that served American soldiers well throughout the war. But doctrine has blind spots. Institutions optimize for the common case, not the exceptional one. And sometimes, in the margins of warfare, in the specific situations that the general rules don't quite cover, a different approach proves necessary. George understood this intuitively. He didn't reject the Garand because he was stubborn or contrarian. He carried one himself when the situation called for it. But he also recognized that there were scenarios where precision mattered more than volume, where patience and accuracy would achieve results that spray and pray could not. He had the courage to insist on bringing his personal weapon despite the ridicule of his superiors, and when the opportunity came to prove its value, he was ready. There is something almost prophetic about George's story when viewed from the perspective of modern military doctrine. Today, every major military in the world maintains dedicated sniper units equipped with precision rifles. The bolt action has not disappeared. It has been refined, improved, and deployed in conflicts from Iraq to Afghanistan to Ukraine. The lessons that George demonstrated on Guadalcanal, that there is a place for the slow, careful, precisely aimed shot in modern warfare, have been validated again and again in the decades since. The Japanese snipers that George faced on Guadalcanal were formidable opponents. They were patient, skilled, and dedicated to their mission. Many of them knew they would not survive, and they accepted this fate with a discipline that American soldiers found both admirable and terrifying. But they were facing something they had never encountered before. A counter-sniper who combined American marksmanship tradition with equipment specifically designed for precision work. The collision of these two approaches, Japanese patience and American precision, decided the fate of the Point Cruz Groves and contributed to the eventual American victory on Guadalcanal. John B. George passed away on January 3, 2009, at the age of 90. He lived long enough to see his memoir become a classic, to witness the evolution of sniper warfare through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, to know that his contributions had helped shape military thinking for generations. The Winchester Model 70 that he carried through 2 theaters of war likely still exists somewhere, perhaps in a collection, perhaps in a museum, perhaps in the hands of a descendant who understands its significance. That mail-order hunting rifle, purchased with 2 years of National Guard pay by a young man who loved to shoot, changed the way America thought about precision marksmanship in combat. The jungle around Point Cruz has reclaimed the ruins where George set up his positions. The trees where Japanese snipers waited have grown old and fallen and been replaced by new growth. The shell craters have filled with earth and vegetation. Nothing remains on the ground to mark what happened there in January 1943. But the legacy persists in the training of modern snipers, in the doctrine that governs their employment, in the understanding that sometimes, in the chaos of war, the most valuable weapon is not the one that fires fastest, but the one that fires true. This is how a mail-order rifle, dismissed as a toy by officers who should have known better, turned an ordinary National Guard lieutenant into Japan's worst nightmare in the Pacific. The story of John George reminds us that warfare is not just about mass and firepower. It is about skill, preparation, and the courage to think differently when conventional approaches fail. George brought all of these qualities to Guadalcanal, and 11 Japanese snipers, men who thought they were the hunters, discovered too late that they had become the prey. The Winchester Model 70 spoke 11 times in those jungles. Each time, a life ended and history changed, if only in small ways. The Point Cruz operation succeeded. The 132nd Infantry advanced. Guadalcanal was eventually secured. The tide of war in the Pacific began to turn, and somewhere in that vast cascade of events, in the calculations of victory and defeat, the contributions of one man with one rifle made a difference. That is the power of precision. That is the legacy of John George. That is how a mail-order rifle became one of the most significant weapons of the Pacific War.